The execution platform gleamed under the artificial suns of Nexus Prime, the Galactic Council's most sacred world. Thousands of alien delegates filled the amphitheater, their diverse forms creating a sea of scales, feathers, and crystalline structures. At the center, a simple metal chair waited. Maya Chen, barely 19 Earth years old, walked toward her death with steady steps. Her wrists bore energy shackles that hummed with containment fields, but her dark eyes held no fear. The crowd murmured in dozens of languages, some expressing satisfaction, others unease. High Chancellor Vorthak, a towering reptilian with golden scales, read the charges from his floating platform. Maya Chen of Terra, you stand convicted of the highest crime against galactic peace. You have bonded with a void dragon, an act forbidden for over 10,000 years. Maya's lips curved into a bitter smile. The Council's hypocrisy never ceased to amaze her. They preached about the dangers of dragon bonding while keeping dozens of the ancient beasts chained in their underground vaults, using them as living weapons when convenient. The penalty for this transgression is death by neural severance, Vorthak continued, his voice echoing through the arena. Your execution will serve as a warning to all who would dare repeat your foolishness. From the shadowed tunnels beneath the platform, a massive form stirred. Kithara, Maya's bonded dragon, felt every spike of her human companion's emotions through their psychic link. The great beast's scales rippled from deep purple to angry crimson, and her claws scraped furrows in the reinforced walls of her prison cell. The dragon had lived for millennia, had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. She remembered when humans first stumbled into the galactic community, confused and primitive by council standards. Most species had dismissed them as another short-lived race destined for obscurity. But Kithara had sensed something different in Maya during their first encounter on the mining world of Kepler 442b. The girl had been part of a human survey team when they'd accidentally breached the dragon's ancient hibernation chamber. Instead of fleeing in terror like her companions, Maya had approached with wonder and respect. The bond had formed instantly, a connection deeper than anything the Council understood. Dragons chose their companions, and the choice was absolute. No law or decree could sever what was forged in the fires of mutual recognition. Above, the execution proceeded with ceremonial precision. Maya was secured to the neural severance chair, a device designed to painlessly separate consciousness from body. The Council believed themselves merciful in their methods, but Kithara knew the truth. They feared dragons, feared the power that came from true partnership between species. Any final words? Vorthak asked, though his tone suggested he found the ritual distasteful. Maya lifted her head, her voice carrying clearly across the silent amphitheater. You think you're executing a criminal, but you're killing hope itself. Humans and dragons together could have reached the stars and beyond. Instead, you choose fear. The Chancellor's scaled hand moved toward the activation switch. In the depths below, Kithara's massive heart thundered with rage and grief. The dragon's eyes blazed with inner fire as ancient memories surfaced. She remembered her first bonded companion, a warrior from a long-dead species who had fought beside her in the old wars. She remembered the Council's promises then, their assurances that dragons would always have a place in the galactic order. Those promises had proven as worthless as space dust. The neural severance beam activated with a low hum, designed to shut down Maya's brain functions in seconds. But as the energy touched her, something unprecedented happened. Instead of simply dying, Maya's consciousness seemed to expand, blazing brighter for an instant before beginning to fade. Through their bond, Kithara felt every moment of her companion's passing. The dragon's anguish transformed into something far more dangerous than grief. Deep in her chest, nuclear fires began to kindle. Her scales shifted to brilliant white-hot, and the reinforced walls of her cell started to glow red. The Council had made a critical error. They had studied dragon physiology for millennia, cataloged their abilities, and created elaborate containment systems, but they had never truly understood what happened when a bonded dragon lost their companion to deliberate murder. They were about to learn. Maya's body slumped in the chair as her neural patterns flatlined. The crowd released a collective breath, some delegates nodding approval while others looked troubled. Chancellor Vorthak raised his hand to declare the execution complete. That's when the first tremor shook Nexus Prime. Far below the execution platform, Kithara's roar of rage shattered the silence. The sound carried through tons of rock and metal, a primal scream of loss that spoke to something ancient in every creature's genetic memory. Even the most hardened council delegates felt their spines crawl. The dragon's containment cell, built to withstand the fury of a star, began to crack. Stress fractures spiderwebbed across surfaces that had been rated as indestructible. Emergency alarms blared as monitoring systems registered impossible energy readings from the depths. Chancellor Vorthak's golden scales paled to sickly yellow. He had overseen dragon executions before, but never the death of a bonded companion. The historical record spoke of such events in hushed tones, describing them as legends best left undisturbed. As the platform shook again, more violently this time, those legends were about to become terrifying reality. In the depths of Nexus Prime, an ancient power was awakening. The Council had shed innocent blood, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. The execution was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The cracks in Cathara's prison spread like lightning across a storm-dark sky. Each fissure pulsed with the dragon's internal fire, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The containment field generators, massive machines the size of buildings, began to smoke and spark as they struggled against forces they were never designed to handle. Security Chief Mortex rushed into the control center, his crystalline body chiming with agitation. The insectoid commander had overseen Nexus Prime's defenses for 3 centuries, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The readings on his screens defied all known physics. "Sir, the dragon's core temperature is approaching stellar levels," reported a trembling technician. "If this continues, she'll achieve nuclear fusion within her own body." Mortex's compound eyes clicked as he processed the implications. Dragons were living fusion reactors, but their biological systems normally regulated the process carefully. What they were witnessing was a complete breakdown of those natural controls, a transformation driven by grief and rage. Above in the amphitheater, the delegates had begun to evacuate in panic. The tremors were coming faster now, each one stronger than the last. Chunks of decorative stone fell from the arena's ceiling, and several of the floating platforms had to emergency land as their stabilization systems failed. Chancellor Vorthak remained at his post, though his clawed hands gripped the podium so tightly that the metal groaned. He had overseen this execution personally, because he believed it necessary for galactic stability. Human-dragon bonds represented a paradigm shift that threatened the Council's carefully maintained order. Humans were unpredictable, passionate and utterly resistant to the structured thinking that kept their galactic civilization functioning. Dragons were ancient, powerful and prideful creatures who had grudgingly accepted Council authority after the last Great War. Together, they represented a combination that could reshape the balance of power across known space. "Evacuate the prisoner transport levels," Vorthak commanded, "and increase power to the containment fields by 50%. "Sir," one of his aides ventured, "perhaps we should consider releasing the dragon. If she's truly achieving uncontrolled fusion..." The Chancellor's head snapped around, his golden eyes blazing. "Release her? After she's witnessed the execution of her bonded companion? That creature would reduce this entire world to radioactive ash." Deep in her cell, Cathara felt the Council's futile attempts to contain her growing power. The energy shackles that had held her for months were simply evaporating under the heat of her transformation. Ancient memories flooded her consciousness. Memories of a time when dragons flew free among the stars, when they were partners rather than prisoners. Maya's death had triggered something primal in the dragon's biology, a response that predated the Council by eons. In the early days of dragon evolution, when one of a bonded pair died violently, the survivor would undergo a metamorphosis designed to exact terrible vengeance on those responsible. The transformation was called Nova Rage in the old texts, and the Council had believed it to be myth. They were about to discover how wrong they had been. Kithara's scales began to shed, revealing new growth underneath that gleamed like captured starlight. Her size increased as her body prepared for the fury to come. Most terrifying of all, her consciousness started to expand beyond the physical, reaching out through dimensions that most species couldn't even perceive. She could sense every living being on Nexus Prime now, could feel their fear like a palpable thing. The dragon's awareness touched the minds of fleeing delegates, panicking security forces, and terrified civilians in the city, beyond the governmental complex. But she also sensed something else, something that gave her pause. In a medical facility 50 kilometers away, human refugees from the mining colonies waited in detention. Maya's people, brought here as witnesses to her trial but kept isolated from the proceedings. Kithara could feel their grief, their helpless rage at being unable to save one of their own. The dragon's fury faltered for a moment. Maya would not want innocent humans to suffer for the Council's crimes. Even in her transformed state, Kithara remembered her companion's gentle nature, her belief that violence should be a last resort. But the Council members responsible for Maya's death were still here, still believing they had acted righteously. They needed to understand the true cost of their decision. The containment field finally collapsed with a sound like breaking crystal. Kithara rose from the ruins of her cell, her new form blazing with barely contained stellar energy. She was no longer just a dragon. She had become something between a living creature and a force of nature. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut throughout the facility, but the dragon's new size and power made such barriers meaningless. She began to ascend through the levels, melting through reinforced barriers like they were made of ice. Security forces assembled with their most powerful weapons, energy cannons capable of stopping a small army. They opened fire as soon as Kithara appeared, filling the corridors with destructive force that would have vaporized most creatures instantly. The beams simply absorbed into the dragon's transformed scales, adding to her already incredible energy reserves. She looked at the soldiers with something that might have been pity, then released a controlled pulse that shut down their weapons without harming the wielders. "Stand aside," Kithara spoke, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated through multiple dimensions. "My quarrel is not with you." The soldiers, trained for courage in the face of impossible odds, broke ranks and fled. They had signed up to protect the Council from external threats, not to fight living embodiments of stellar fury. As Kithara continued her ascent toward the surface, her senses detected the emergency protocols activating throughout Nexus Prime. Orbital defense platforms were powering up, and military vessels were moving into position around the planet. The Council was preparing for war against a single dragon. They still didn't understand what they were truly facing. Kithara was no longer bound by the limitations of physical existence. She had become vengeance incarnate, and no force in the galaxy could stop what was coming. The surface access tunnels lay just ahead, and beyond them waited those responsible for Maya's death. Kithara burst through the surface of Nexus Prime like a newborn star. Her emergence cracked the execution platform in half, sending chunks of ceremonial stone flying in all directions. The few remaining delegates who hadn't evacuated screamed and scrambled for cover as the transformed dragon rose into the artificial sky. She was magnificent and terrifying, her new form stretching nearly 100 meters from nose to tail. Her scales rippled with contained nuclear fire, and her eyes had become miniature suns that cast harsh shadows across the governmental complex. When she spread her wings, the membranes between the supporting bones glowed like stained glass windows filled with stellar plasma. Chancellor Vorthak stood frozen at his podium, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. The historical archives had contained fragments about Nova Rage transformations, but the Council had dismissed them as primitive mythology. Seeing Kithara in her transformed state, he realized their ancestors had been trying to warn them. "All units, concentrate fire on the dragon," Vorthak commanded through his communicator. "Use everything we have." The orbital defense platforms responded immediately. Massive energy beams lanced down from space, each one carrying enough power to level a city block. They struck Kithara directly, and for a moment hope flared in the watching Council members. Then the dragon simply absorbed the energy, her scales growing brighter as the orbital bombardment fed her transformation. She looked up at the attacking satellites with something resembling amusement. "You still don't understand," Kithara said, her voice now carrying across the entire planet without need for technology. "I am no longer limited by your physics." She drew in a deep breath, and every living being on Nexus Prime felt their atoms vibrate in response. When she exhaled, a controlled fusion reaction erupted from her mouth, not aimed at the surface but directed skyward. The beam struck 3 orbital platforms simultaneously, and they simply ceased to exist, converted to their component atoms in an instant. The demonstration sent panic through the remaining Council forces. This wasn't a creature they could fight with conventional weapons. This was something that existed beyond their understanding of natural law. But Kithara wasn't interested in wholesale destruction. Her expanded consciousness could sense every human on the planet, and she felt their terror mixed with a growing sense of hope. Maya's people had heard her voice, had seen the impossible sight of a dragon's vengeance unleashed on their behalf. In the detention facility, Dr. Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the reinforced window of her cell. As head of the human survey team that had first encountered Kithara, she understood better than most what was happening. The dragon wasn't just seeking revenge. She was making a statement that would echo across the galaxy. "My God," whispered James Fletcher, Maya's former teammate. "She's really doing it. She's showing them what happens when you murder innocents." The guards had abandoned their posts when the orbital platforms died, leaving the human prisoners locked in their cells but unguarded. Dr. Martinez could hear other alien prisoners throughout the facility, their various voices raised in prayers, curses, and desperate attempts to contact anyone who might rescue them. Back at the governmental complex, Kithara descended toward the council chambers with deliberate slowness. Her transformed state granted her awareness of every living being in the building, and she could taste their emotions like physical substances. Fear dominated, but she also sensed anger, confusion, and in a few cases, something that might have been shame. Chancellor Vorthak had retreated to the emergency command center, surrounded by the most advanced defensive systems the Council could deploy. Force fields powerful enough to stop antimatter explosions wrapped around the building in layers. Automated, defense turrets tracked Kithara's approach with targeting systems that could calculate firing solutions on objects moving at significant fractions of light speed. None of it mattered. Kithara simply walked through the barriers as if they didn't exist. Her transformed state operated on principles that the Council's science couldn't explain, much less counter. She moved through solid matter like it was empty space, while her presence warped local reality in ways that made their sensors give impossible readings. "Vorthak," the dragon said as she materialized inside the command center, her voice containing harmonics that made the chamber's walls resonate like a struck bell. "We need to talk." The Chancellor found himself staring into eyes that contained miniature galaxies. Part of his mind, the part trained in diplomatic protocol, noted that she had used his name rather than his title. The gesture somehow made her presence even more intimidating. "What do you want?" he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "I want you to understand what you've done," Kithara replied. "Maya Chen wasn't just my bonded companion. She was proof that your species' barriers are illusions, that consciousness transcends the physical forms you use to categorize and separate." Around the command center, monitoring equipment began to malfunction as the dragon's presence interfered with their electronics. Data screens flickered between normal displays and impossible readings that suggested reality itself was becoming unstable in her vicinity. "You've spent millennia maintaining an order based on fear," Kithara continued. "Fear of change, fear of evolution, fear of species working together instead of competing for your approval. Maya represented everything you were afraid of. She broke the law," Vorthak protested, though his conviction was wavering. "Dragon bonding has been forbidden since the Synthesis Wars. The historical precedent was created by cowards who feared what they couldn't control," Kithara interrupted. Her scales flared brighter, and several of the command center's displays exploded in showers of sparks. "You've kept my people as weapons while denying them partnership. You've suppressed the natural evolution of consciousness itself." The Chancellor looked around his command center, noting how his staff had pressed themselves against the far walls. Even his most loyal subordinates recognized that they were witnessing something beyond their ability to comprehend or combat. "What happens now?" Vorthak asked. Kithara's expression shifted, becoming something that might have been sad. "Now you learn that some actions have consequences that extend beyond your ability to calculate or control. Maya's death has changed things, Chancellor. The universe itself has taken notice." As if summoned by her words, space around Nexus Prime began to shimmer with new arrivals. The space around Nexus Prime erupted with dimensional rifts as ships materialized from hyperspace. But these weren't ordinary vessels. Each one pulsed with the same stellar energy that surrounded Kithara, and their designs defied conventional starship architecture. They moved like living things, organic curves flowing through space with predatory grace. Dragon ships, ancient vessels that hadn't been seen in the galaxy for over 5,000 years. Chancellor Vorthak watched the displays in his command center with growing horror. The ships weren't attacking, but their very presence sent electromagnetic pulses through his monitoring systems. Each vessel was massive, easily dwarfing the Council's largest battleships, and they moved with a coordination that suggested a collective intelligence. Impossible, breathed Admiral Korath, the military commander who had overseen Dragon containment protocols. The great ships were destroyed in the synthesis wars. We have documentation of their elimination. Kythera's laugh echoed through the command center, a sound like solar wind singing through crystal formations. You documented what you chose to see, Admiral. Dragons have been traveling between dimensions long before your species learned to chip flint. Did you really think we kept all our capabilities in one reality? Through the enhanced awareness granted by her transformation, Kythera could sense the confusion and terror spreading through the Council's leadership. They had built their entire galactic order on the assumption that they understood and controlled all significant powers in their sphere of influence. The arrival of the Dragon fleet shattered that illusion completely. In the detention facility, Dr. Martinez felt the atmospheric pressure change as the great ships positioned themselves in orbit. Through her cell window, she could see streaks of light painting impossible patterns across the sky. Her scientific mind raced to process what she was witnessing. They're not just ships, she whispered to her fellow prisoners. They're extensions of Dragon consciousness, living vessels that exist partially outside normal space-time. James Fletcher pressed against the window beside her. How many are there? Dr. Martinez tried to count the light patterns but gave up as more continued to appear. Dozens, maybe hundreds. It's like they're arriving from every corner of the galaxy simultaneously. The truth was even more staggering than she realized. Dragons throughout the galaxy had felt Maya's death through the quantum consciousness network that connected their species across vast distances. The execution of an innocent bonded companion had triggered an ancient defense protocol, one that superseded all political considerations. For the first time in millennia, the scattered Dragon clans were acting as one. Back in the command center, Kythera's form began to shift again. Her physical presence became translucent, and Chancellor Vorthak could see through her body to the stars beyond. She was becoming something between matter and energy, existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Council will witness a demonstration, she announced, her voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere. You will understand what partnership truly means, and why your fear of it was so catastrophically misguided. One of the Dragon ships descended through the atmosphere, its passage creating aurora-like displays that painted the sky in colors that had no names. The vessel settled gently beside the governmental complex, its hull rippling like liquid metal as it adjusted its shape to the landing surface. A section of the ship's hull simply dissolved, revealing an interior that defied geometric logic. Spaces seemed to fold in on themselves, and corridors extended into distances that shouldn't have been possible within the ship's external dimensions. From this impossible interior emerged figures that made the watching council delegates gasp in recognition and terror. Dragons, but not as they had ever been seen before. These creatures moved with purpose and intelligence that radiated from every gesture. Their scales shifted through spectrums of color that suggested they were processing information on levels beyond ordinary perception. But most shocking of all were their companions. Humans walked beside the dragons, not as prisoners or servants, but as equals. Their eyes held the same deep intelligence as their dragon partners, and they moved with a confidence that spoke of shared consciousness and mutual respect. Impossible, Chancellor Vorthak whispered. The bonding process was eliminated. We destroyed all the compatibility research. You destroyed research conducted within your limited understanding, Kythera corrected. Dragons and humans found other ways to connect, ways that transcended your crude attempts at control. The truth was that dragon-human partnerships had never truly ended. Scattered across the galaxy's frontier regions, away from council oversight, the bonds had continued to develop. What Vorthak was witnessing represented decades of hidden evolution, the birth of something entirely new in galactic civilization. One of the bonded pairs approached the command center, moving through the walls as easily as Kythera had done. The human was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held depths of knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. Her dragon companion was smaller than Cathara, but no less impressive, scales shifting through phases of matter as they walked. "I am Dr. Elena Vasquez," the woman said, her voice carrying the same dimensional harmonics as her dragon partner. "This is Zethrin. We represent the Synthesis Union, an alliance you thought you had prevented from forming." Chancellor Vorthak tried to process what he was hearing. The Synthesis Union had been a theoretical concept discussed in classified council documents, the nightmare scenario of organized cooperation between dragons and humans. According to their models, such an alliance would fundamentally alter the balance of power in galactic civilization. "You're speaking of rebellion against lawful galactic authority," Admiral Korath interjected, though his voice lacked conviction. Zethrin spoke for the first time, his words creating visible ripples in the air around them. "We speak of evolution, Admiral. Consciousness is not bound by the artificial limitations your species prefer. Maya Chen's death was unnecessary, but it has served to illuminate truths you've spent centuries trying to suppress." Through the command center's remaining functional displays, Vorthak could see similar scenes playing out across Nexus Prime. Dragon ships had landed at key facilities throughout the planet, and bonded pairs were materializing in government buildings, military installations, and detention centers they weren't attacking or conquering. They were simply making their existence known, demonstrating capabilities that rendered the Council's authority meaningless. "What do you want?" Vorthak asked, finally acknowledging that negotiation was his only remaining option. Dr. Vasquez smiled, an expression that held both compassion and implacable determination. "We want you to witness the future, Chancellor. We want you to understand what your fear has prevented, and what Maya Chen died believing was possible." The transformation of galactic civilization had begun, triggered by the death of one human girl and the grief of her dragon companion. The Council was about to learn that some changes could not be stopped, only embraced or suffered through. The demonstration began with a simple gesture from Dr. Vasquez. She placed her hand on Zethrin's scaled flank, and both their forms blazed with shared energy. In that instant, every electronic device in the command center began displaying the same impossible data stream. Chancellor Vorthak watched in stunned silence as information flowed across his screens. Information that shouldn't have existed according to everything the Council believed about consciousness and reality. The displays showed neural patterns that spanned multiple species, quantum entanglement signatures that connected minds across galactic distances, and energy readings that suggested thought itself could be measured and directed. "This is the synthesis," Dr. Vasquez explained, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber walls resonate. "Not the crude joining of minds that your scientists theorized, but something far more profound. We've learned to share consciousness while maintaining individual identity, to think as one while remaining ourselves." Through the data streams, Vorthak could see glimpses of colonies he'd never heard of. Worlds where humans and dragons worked together to terraform planets, to develop technologies that merged organic and mechanical principles, to explore regions of space that conventional physics said should be impossible to reach. "You've been building a civilization in secret," Admiral Korath realized, his voice tight with implications he was only beginning to understand. Zethrin's response rippled through dimensions, creating patterns of meaning that bypassed language entirely. "Not in secret, Admiral. In plain sight beyond the boundaries of your awareness. While you maintained order through separation and control, we explored unity and cooperation." Cathara, still translucent and existing in multiple states simultaneously, gestured toward the displays. "Maya was meant to be an ambassador between our worlds. She came to you with open hands, seeking to share what we had learned. Your response was to murder her for daring to suggest that your way was not the only way." The truth of that statement hit Vorthak like a physical blow. Maya Chen's trial had been a foregone conclusion from the moment she was arrested. The Council had seen her bond with Cathara not as an opportunity for understanding, but as a threat to their established order. They had chosen execution because dialogue might have led to change, and change was something they feared above all else. "The consequences of that choice extend beyond your comprehension," Dr. Vasquez continued. "Maya's death has awakened protective instincts that have lain dormant in dragon consciousness for millennia. Every bonded pair in the galaxy felt her passing, and they are coming to answer that call. As if summoned by her words, more dragon ships materialized around Nexus Prime. The planet was becoming the center of the largest gathering of dragon consciousness in recorded history, and with them came their human partners, each pair representing a different approach to the synthesis of species capabilities. In the detention facility, the human prisoners watched through their windows as bonded pairs moved through the corridors, systematically releasing every being held in the complex. The dragons didn't simply break down barriers. They seemed to convince the barriers to dissolve themselves, matter responding to consciousness in ways that violated fundamental assumptions about reality. Dr. Martinez found herself face to face with a young man whose eyes held the depth of someone who had lived multiple lifetimes. His dragon companion was sleek and graceful, scales shifting through patterns that suggested rapid communication. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the man said, though she was certain they had never met. I am Marcus Chen, Maya's older brother. This is Stellaris. We've come to collect our people and honor our sister's memory. The revelation that Maya had family among the bonded pairs sent shockwaves through Dr. Martinez's understanding of recent events. Maya hadn't been an isolated case or an accident of circumstance. She had been part of a larger community, a network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. How many of you are there? Dr. Martinez asked as her cell barrier simply faded away. More than the Council ever imagined, Marcus replied. Fewer than we need to be. Maya was going to change that. She was going to show them that synthesis didn't threaten their civilization. It could enhance it beyond their wildest dreams. Back in the command center, Chancellor Vorthak was struggling to process the magnitude of the situation. The arrival of hundreds of dragon ships around Nexus Prime represented a concentration of power that could reduce the planet to cosmic dust. Yet the bonded pairs showed no interest in destruction. Instead, they seemed focused on rescue and revelation. You could destroy us, he said to Cathara, finally acknowledging the reality of their situation. Why haven't you? The transformed dragon's expression shifted, becoming something that might have been sad, because Maya wouldn't have wanted that. Even as she died, she hoped you would eventually understand. She believed in the possibility of growth, even in those who had condemned her. Through her expanded consciousness, Kithara could sense the broader implications of this moment. Across the galaxy, other Council worlds were experiencing similar visitations as bonded pairs revealed themselves. It wasn't an invasion or a rebellion, it was an unveiling, a demonstration of what had been developing beyond the Council's awareness. The old order is ending, Dr. Vasquez stated simply. The question is whether it ends through violence and chaos or through transformation and growth. Maya died believing in the possibility of transformation. We're here to honor that belief. Zethrin added his voice to the declaration, harmonics creating visible ripples in the air. We offer partnership, not conquest. We offer evolution, not destruction. But we will no longer hide what we've become, and we will no longer tolerate the murder of innocents who dare to dream of better futures. Chancellor Vorthak looked around his command center, noting how his staff watched the proceedings with expressions ranging from terror to wonder. Some of them, he realized, were beginning to understand that they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new in galactic civilization. The Council had maintained order for thousands of years by preventing exactly this kind of paradigm shift. They had separated species, regulated consciousness, and suppressed technologies that might lead to unexpected evolution. Now all of that careful control was unraveling in the space of a few hours. What happens to the Council? He asked, knowing that the answer would determine the fate of billions of beings across the galaxy. Dr. Vasquez and Zethrin exchanged a look that contained volumes of shared thought. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of collective decision made by minds operating in synthesis. That depends entirely on you, Chancellor. The old ways have failed, but that doesn't mean all structure must be abandoned. We're offering you the chance to evolve, to become part of something greater than the sum of its parts. As she spoke, the air around them began to shimmer with new possibilities, reality itself seeming to bend toward configurations that had never existed before. The demonstration was reaching its climax, and with it, the moment of choice that would determine the future of galactic civilization. The choice came not as a dramatic ultimatum, but as a gentle invitation that resonated through every consciousness on Nexus Prime. Kithra's transformed presence expanded one final time, her awareness touching every mind on the planet simultaneously. Through that contact, she shared not words or threats, but pure experience, the memory of what it felt like to be truly connected to another consciousness. Chancellor Vorthak gasped as the sensation flooded through him. For the first time in his long life, he experienced what it meant to think as part of a greater whole while maintaining his individual identity. The fear that had driven council policy for millennia dissolved as he understood that synthesis didn't erase the self. It enhanced it beyond measure. Around the command center, his staff underwent similar revelations. Admiral Korath staggered as he felt what it would be like to approach military strategy, not as competition, but as collaborative problem-solving. Dr. Thane, the council's chief xenobiologist, wept as she experienced firsthand the consciousness of species she had studied only as specimens. "This is what Maya saw," Dr. Vasquez said softly as the demonstration faded. "This is what she died trying to show you, not the loss of individual identity, but the expansion of what consciousness can become when barriers dissolve." Sethran's harmonics added layers of meaning that words could never capture. Fear drove you to execute an innocent, but understanding can drive you to ensure such tragedy never happens again. Across Nexus Prime, similar awakenings were occurring. In the detention facility, Dr. Martinez found herself understanding the alien prisoners she had been confined with. Their different forms of consciousness no longer barriers but fascinating variations on the theme of awareness. In the military installations, soldiers were laying down weapons as they realized they were facing not enemies, but potential partners in evolution. Most significantly, in the deepest vaults of the council complex, other dragons who had been held in containment for decades began to stir. Kithra's transformation had awakened something in them as well, a remembrance of what they had been before capture, what they could become again with willing companions. Chancellor Vorthak struggled to his feet, his worldview fundamentally altered by the brief contact with synthesis consciousness. "The old laws," he said hesitantly, "the prohibitions against bonding, the separation protocols, were born from ignorance and maintained by fear," Kithra replied, her form beginning to solidify as her fury transformed into something more constructive. "But ignorance can be cured with knowledge, and fear can be overcome with understanding." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, extending her hand to the Chancellor. "We're not here to destroy your civilization, but to offer it a chance to grow beyond its current limitations. The galaxy is vast enough for many different approaches to consciousness and cooperation." As Vorthak reached out to take her hand, a cascade of possibility flowed between them. Through Zethran's consciousness bridging them, he saw visions of worlds where different species worked together as true equals, where technological advancement was driven by collaborative thought rather than competitive advantage, where the very concept of us versus them had evolved into us together. "The other council members," Vorthak said, his voice filled with wonder and uncertainty, "they'll resist. Many of them have built their entire identities around maintaining separation." Marcus Chen materialized in the command center, having completed his mission to free the human prisoners. Stellaris flowed beside him like liquid starlight, her presence adding new harmonics to the conversation. "Resistance is natural," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss transformed into purpose. "My sister knew she would face resistance. She chose to become a bridge anyway, knowing the cost. Now we honor her choice by offering that same bridge to others." Through the expanded network of dragon consciousness, information flowed about similar scenes playing out across the galaxy. On dozens of council worlds, bonded pairs were revealing themselves, offering demonstrations of synthesis, extending invitations to evolution. The response was mixed. Some worlds embraced the possibility, others recoiled in terror, and still others remained paralyzed by uncertainty. But the change had begun, and change once started has its own momentum. Kithra, her transformation now complete, had settled into a new form that was both dragon and something more. Her scales held depths that suggested they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and her eyes contained knowledge accumulated across species barriers. "Maya's death was a tragedy," she said, addressing not just those in the command center, but every consciousness touched by the synthesis network. "But her life was a prophecy. She showed us what we could become, and her sacrifice has opened pathways that will endure long after those who killed her have returned to cosmic dust. The memorial that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. Across hundreds of worlds, beings of every species gathered to honor not just Maya Chen, but the principle she had died defending. The ceremonies were conducted through synthesis consciousness, allowing participants to share not just words but emotions, memories, and hopes for the future. In the years that followed, the galaxy slowly transformed. The Galactic Council evolved into something more collaborative, with synthesis pairs serving as bridges between species that had never successfully communicated before. Technologies emerged that merged organic and mechanical principles in ways that neither dragons nor humans could have achieved alone. There was resistance, conflict, and setbacks. Some regions of the galaxy rejected synthesis entirely, creating pockets of the old order that served as reminders of what had been. But the overall trajectory was clear. Consciousness was expanding, barriers were dissolving, and the universe itself seemed to be awakening to new possibilities. On Nexus Prime, a memorial garden grew where the execution platform had stood. At its center, a crystal formation held Maya's final words, preserved in harmonics that could be felt across dimensional boundaries. Visitors from across the galaxy came to pay their respects, but more importantly, to pledge themselves to the future she had envisioned. Kythera remained on Nexus Prime as well, serving as both guardian and teacher. Her transformation had stabilized into something that was part dragon, part force of nature, and part living symbol of what consciousness could become when freed from artificial limitations. She often stood in the memorial garden, her presence a reminder that some bonds transcend death itself. Maya Chen's execution had ended one life, but it had given birth to a new form of galactic civilization, one where the barriers between species were seen not as necessary protections, but as challenges to be overcome. The Dragon's Vigil continued, honoring the memory of a human girl whose death had changed everything, and whose life had shown the galaxy what it could become when love and understanding conquered fear and separation. In the end, the Council had not just beheaded a human girl, they had inadvertently executed the old order itself, making way for something far more beautiful and terrible than they had ever imagined possible. The future belonged to synthesis, and Maya Chen's sacrifice had made it inevitable.